He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Mediawatch. I'm Colin Peacock. Last week here on Mediawatch we mentioned new research on New Zealanders' trust in news and journalism and what they expect from their media. And among the intriguing findings, more than half of participants didn't have high expectations of news organisations that are publicly funded or state-owned. But about 1 in 3 did, citing impartiality, objectivity, balance, accuracy and accountability as key expectations. And among the things 2 out of 3 respondents expected from all their news media, that mistakes will be acknowledged and corrected promptly. Well, this week it became clear that the first and the biggest public broadcaster of all, the BBC, fell down on that job with terminal career consequences for 2 of its very top brass.
And we start this hour with that breaking news. In the past hour, the BBC Director General Tim Davie and the CEO of News, Deborah Turness, have both announced their resignations. The BBC has come under fire over a Panorama report that was accused of misleading editing on a speech by Donald Trump that made it look like he was urging people to attack the US Capitol.
That was BBC TV's news channel breaking the news on Monday morning our time. It was Sunday night in the UK and Remembrance Day, the day that victims of war are remembered there. And that's ironic perhaps for the BBC because, as we'll hear, it wasn't just that editing error in a year-old doco about Donald Trump that created all that controversy. An ongoing culture war that's bigger than the BBC was part of the backdrop to all this. Now, the BBC has been accustomed to political pressure and criticism for over 100 years, but the US president taking credit for making it accountable for fake news and threatening to sue the BBC for $1 billion because of it was something former BBC TV journalist Lewis Goodall struggled to get his head around.
A foreign power, a foreign head of government, basically saying he got them sacked or forced their resignation. And indeed, it is not just, of course, Donald Trump, in a sense, claiming credit for this. It is this curious, bizarre, potentially quite sinister alliance between the president, Boris Johnson, the former prime minister who called for Tim Davie to go, and the Daily Telegraph itself. It is a head-spinning set of developments.
And in addition to all that, internal politics in the BBC itself was a big part of the story. But before we get into that part of it, how did one single editing error topple the BBC's top boss and its news chief in one go, a full year after the programme was actually aired, with no real controversy at all at the time? Well, as you probably know by now from the news, the fateful mistake was made in an episode of Panorama, the BBC's flagship factual programme, in fact, the world's longest-running regular weekly TV news show. That episode a year ago, called Trump, A Second Chance, sought to explain Donald Trump's appeal to his supporters in the upcoming election. Incidentally, scepticism about the news media was one of the things those in the programme cited a lot. However, when Trump, A Second Chance aired 1 year ago, it went down pretty well. The Guardian's reviewer gave it 4 stars out of 5 and said this:
"It has ploughed its furrow well, taking time and care to unpick how we got here and why."
But clearly the Guardian's reviewer didn't notice the lack of care taken unpicking bits of Trump's speech back on the 6th of January 2021 and sticking them back together in that documentary.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
But a consultant on standards within the BBC, Michael Prescott, did notice that, and he put it in a dossier along with other things that he deemed to be editorial failures at the BBC. Earlier this month, that document was leaked to the right-leaning Daily Telegraph newspaper, a persistent critic of the BBC down the years in the UK, and last week they led with this.
The BBC doctored a Donald Trump speech by making him appear to encourage the Capitol Hill riot, according to an internal whistleblowing memo.
And the paper's associate editor Gordon Rayner then laid it out like this in an online video.
The BBC spliced together 2 clips that took place 54 minutes apart. So let's go through it again.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you.
Now, see there, between Capitol and, that's a cut. Here's what Trump actually said.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
It wasn't until nearly an hour later that he then said the second part of the BBC's version.
And we fight like hell.
Well, the edit was certainly deceptive, as was footage in that Panorama episode of the Proud Boys marching in Washington, D.C. that was shot before Trump spoke and not afterwards, as the program seemed to indicate. But both mistakes would have been easily fixed with the addition of just a time code over the images or even some sort of screen wipe or flash to indicate that time had passed. And BBC News reports by their own journalists at the time actually did just that. But according to Gordon Rayner at the Daily Telegraph, it all raised this big question.
The BBC's Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee member who wrote this memo raised all of these concerns, among others, with the BBC executive, but they were dismissed, ignored, and even accused of cherry-picking. But if members of its own Editorial Standards Committee have no faith in the broadcaster, you have to ask, should we?
Well, not if you're a Daily Telegraph reader, it seems. It's now verified the BBC is biased, said another headline in the Daily Telegraph that same day, and that was above a column by Stephen Pollard, a former editor of the UK's Jewish Chronicle newspaper, previously highly critical of the BBC's coverage of the Israel-Gaza war. Now, in the days since, the bad news about the BBC has just kept coming in the Daily Telegraph. Last Tuesday, for example, another headline insisted,
"A third of public believes BBC has left-wing bias."
And that was according to a snap poll conducted by the pollster YouGov after the Telegraph scoop last week. But while 31% did think the BBC had a left bias, the same proportion didn't know, and 38% didn't think the BBC leaned to the left. Another outlet highly critical of the BBC, the right-wing GB News, also accused the BBC of rewriting history with that Donald Trump edit. But Roger Bolton, a former BBC journalist who for years hosted a Mediawatch type show called Right to Reply on the UK's Channel 4, told the distinctly hostile GB News hosts it really wasn't a material error.
Let's look at the question of the Panorama. The overall programme was fair. That editing was not fair and should not have been done. But the BBC's made a mistake. It should come out. It's wrong of it not to come out and explain the circumstances. But to use one small example to suggest that the whole organisation is biased, and for you to take seriously the White House, talking this being 100% propaganda, when their record in relation to the truth is, well, shall we say, strange.
And later in this programme, I'll be asking Roger Bolton about that and more. His namesake, but no relation, Adam Bolton, a former political editor at Rupert Murdoch-owned Sky News UK, also reckoned there was a campaign against the BBC.
Media organisations such as the Telegraph, which has been campaigning on this matter, which frankly are vastly inferior to the BBC when it comes to partisanship and balance, are managing to set an agenda and to stir up a political response.
But back here, News Talk ZB's go-to guy for news from the UK, Enda Brady, also a former Sky News reporter, told the Drive host Heather Duplessis-Allen,
I think it's a very big deal. It goes to the absolute fundamental tenet of journalism, the facts. And whoever edited that Trump interview, 54 minutes was the gap between the two clips, by the way. 54 minutes. So this was not something that was just done by accident.
After which Heather Duplessis-Allen herself weighed in with this pretty definitive take last Tuesday.
Because if you thought that the media was unfair on Trump, now you've been proven right. If you thought that the media was soft on Hamas, now you've been proven right. If you thought that there was all this stuff going on where the media had fixed views on trans issues, now you've been proven right. All you need to do is look at that whistleblower's dossier that was leaked last week. For the most part, that will explain all of it to you.
But Heather Duplessis-Allen didn't explain why she regarded one previously unknown advisor's 120-page personal document as the gospel. Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, the co-hosts of the popular British podcast The Rest is Politics, clearly didn't think so, especially on that unfair to Trump claim.
You know, the thing about they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats. This was given disproportionate coverage. What does that mean? What does that mean? It's like he's the most talked about person on the planet, and he happened to be saying this. It gave disproportionate coverage to a single poll. It should have done an equally aggressive documentary about Kamala Harris. It's just nuts.
But the former BBC presenter Emily Maitlis, on her current podcast The News Agents, pointed out that in the UK, the likes of the Daily Telegraph had their own reasons for bagging the Beeb over its mistakes.
It is the most read, the most sort of enjoyed website pretty much in the world, right? And it operates 24 hours a day. It operates from Australia and America and Asia and all over the place. And the papers, frankly, cannot compete. Yeah. That's the website that the Mail would like to have, the website the Times would like to have, the Telegraph would like to have. They could attack the BBC by saying, look, this is anti-competition, you're too dominant, you're using public money to come onto our turf. I think they'd have a very good case for saying that. But if you do that, then you just alert the public, basically, to the fact that they're getting all this stuff. They're getting all the free stuff they want on the website. And so the way it has been reshaped, the way it's been reworded is you're being cheated by the BBC. They've got an ideological position and you are not getting the whole truth and the BBC is lying to you. And actually, if the papers as one carry on telling the British public that they're being lied to, they can't trust the BBC is bent, the BBC is ideologically to the left, then people start believing it.
Meanwhile, a former news editor at the rival UK channel, Channel 4, Dorothy Byrne, was even more succinct.
It is overwhelmingly an excellent journalistic organisation prone to making stupid mistakes.
But by this time, the BBC's critics had already lined up to condemn the mistake as much more than just that on the BBC's own news channel. After the resignation news broke on Monday morning, the first person on the line was Kelvin Mackenzie, formerly Rupert Murdoch's top tabloid editor and then the boss of a rival radio company which railed against the BBC's funding for years.
Things like the Trump doctoring of the tape are a massive, massive issue. When you start doing that to the President of the United States, what are you doing to somebody cleaning a window in Preston? You know, if you can't be trusted on that.
And the next to react to the breaking news on the BBC was another of its loudest critics in the UK and a former commercial rival, David Elstein.
And it gives an opportunity to bring in people who perhaps understand the changing nature of the country. And there was a recent survey out right now in which everybody feels rather depressed about the nation. And I think we have to understand where that's coming from. And obviously migration plays a role in that and the economy plays a role in that. I don't criticise the BBC over its straightforward political coverage. I think they probably do their best in a very difficult area, but I do blame them in looking at some of the social issues facing our country and them getting on the wrong side of almost every argument.
Now, the notion that coverage of issues should be based on public opinion at the BBC was rebutted later on BBC Radio by a former Conservative Party politician and former chair of the BBC Trust, Lord Chris Patten.
I don't think anybody's complacent about the difficulties of covering this difficult, dangerous world as well as possible. But I don't think that we should allow ourselves to be bullied into thinking that the BBC is only any good if it reflects the prejudice of the last person who shouted at it.
And there was a fair bit of shouting with the Northern Irish host Stephen Nolan when David Elstein returned on BBC Radio later on.
The BBC is simply not accountable to anyone. It's not accountable to the government. It's not accountable to the Culture Committee. It's not accountable
how is that true? Can you not see the accountability tonight? The Director General's lost his job. Deborah Turness have lost their job. Ofcom holds the BBC accountable.
No, it doesn't.
There's an editorial complaints unit where the public can
have you ever tried to
argue.
Use it? Have you ever tried to use that?
I'm subject to it quite a lot.
David Elstein went on to tell Stephen Nolan the BBC had run scared of public opinion on the issue of transgender identity, only to be told by Stephen Nolan that he himself had made a 10-part series on the topic for the BBC last year.
We're scrutinising the BBC just as we would any politician or anyone else. I've spoken to a number of journalists within the BBC who are really uncomfortable about this relationship with Stonewall, but don't think that they can talk. But now we have someone to talk. She's just left the BBC, but she's willing to speak now.
Now, the trans rights issue and Gaza coverage and other things were also in that report on editorial failings at the BBC by the outside advisor Michael Prescott, which kicked off this crisis once it leaked to the Daily Telegraph. But last Monday, the departing BBC News CEO Deborah Turness made this point forcefully.
But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased. That's why it's the world's most trusted news provider.
And critics of BBC governance and management are now saying that the BBC's real problem with impartiality is not in its news, but in its governance and monitoring that's been skewed by political influence. A 13-strong BBC board currently includes business leaders and lawyers, but only 3 people with any substantial record in journalism. And a key committee that looks after editorial standards includes Sir Robbie Gibb, a former journalist turned political appointee during Boris Johnson's time as Prime Minister, after he'd served as a PR man for the Conservative Party Prime Minister, Theresa May. Now, Michael Prescott, the former advisor to the Editorial Standards Committee who was the author of that now notorious dossier, was also a PR man for a company with links to the Conservative Party for 9 years. On her podcast, The Newsagents, Emily Maitlis claimed this week that as many as 6 former BBC News colleagues had been in touch with her to claim that a kind of internal coup is now underway to influence BBC News, and the incoming news bosses would struggle to deal with that within the BBC. Well, the man left in charge of the news division at the BBC now is Jonathan Munro, who was criticised in Michael Prescott's report for not responding adequately to concern about that Trump documentary edit and the BBC's coverage of Gaza. And 2 years ago, when the Gaza conflict was just weeks old and the BBC's journalists were already under fire for the way they were reporting it, the criticism was coming from the ruling Conservative Party. And back then, Jonathan Munro, then the BBC's Director of Journalism, told me this on Mediawatch.
Of course, like all organisations based on human judgment, we sometimes make mistakes. That's life. And when we make mistakes, we need to be open to criticism, and we need to be open to views about what we do in the normal course of events. We're not short of views about what the BBC does and doesn't do. It's part of the political discourse, and where it's unhelpful, of course, we wish that people had sometimes kept their counsel, but we're not in the business of trying to mute people who have problems with the BBC.
And 2 years ago, Jonathan Munro also told me he still had faith in the BBC's existing standards withstanding political pressure. Well, he'll need that faith now that he's the boss of BBC News after the resignation of Deborah Turnus.
Do you think that the journalists are corrupt like President Trump says? Do you think the journalists are corrupt?
Our journalists aren't corrupt. Our journalists are hard-working people who strive for impartiality, and I will stand by their journalism.
Well, as we heard earlier, the veteran UK journalist Roger Bolton said that Panorama edit of Donald Trump a year ago was misleading, but the Panorama programme overall itself wasn't. And he should know he's a former editor of Panorama, but he's no BBC apologist. He's presented a show on a rival channel called Right to Reply, which often criticised the BBC, and also one called Feedback that did the same on BBC Radio. And now he makes the independent podcast Mediawatch for people who, he says, care about or are frustrated by the BBC.
It's a fundamental error. If you were in print, for example, you would, if you're using two statements from somebody like Trump, you would put dots in the middle to indicate there was a gap in between, or you might even say 45 minutes later he said this. And in television, you've got the equivalent, which is a white flash, or you could just put up, 45 minutes later, boom. What you mustn't ever do is elide or put 2 clips together to give the impression that it's the same sentence. But as you say, nobody noticed at the time. And it's not surprising because it's absolutely clear. Well, he'd encourage his supporters to come to Washington. He'd encourage them to go to the Capitol Hill. He'd encourage them to make their physical presence quite intimidating. He'd tried to get his vice president to, this is a man who was trying to steal the election that he called a steal. And that's why I suppose people didn't notice when these 2 bits of interview were edited together. What should have happened? Very straightforwardly, they should have said, sorry about that, edited the piece of Panorama. But they didn't. The news division defended it. And there was a big argument in this sort of governance at the top of the BBC. And so when this came out, the BBC was silent. A week before the BBC said anything. And every day a new allegation. Well, as it happened, most of the concerns that had been raised in that dossier had been addressed and action taken. But you wouldn't know that because the BBC didn't say anything. And the reason it didn't say anything was it was split at the top. And I think it's some substance to it. There are a number of right-wing members of that Editorial Standards Committee who have real doubts about BBC's impartiality and welcome this opportunity, if you like, to create trouble. And they've further compounded by the fact that the chair of the BBC, who should stand above all this and should act in the public interest, was part of that very committee which decided to, first of all, ignore the problem and then remain silent about it.
The BBC has now apologised via the chair, Samir Shah. They've sent the message to the White House, this is Friday night New Zealand time, but insisted that they don't believe it was defamatory according to their legal opinion, and signalled, they're not going to pay any kind of compensation. Does that strike you as a good move, a good response?
Yes, well, you can't be bullied, can you, like this? I mean, we know what Trump does. He sues people or says he's going to sue them, and he quotes ridiculous amounts of money. And in the United States, where he can control things, large media companies for whom their news operation is only a small part, are very happy to settle even though they could win their case. Not so with the BBC. The BBC would have been incredibly stupid if it had actually caved in. First of all, I don't think he's got a legal case. Second, that the program wasn't broadcast in the United States. It's not, I think, defamatory. You'd have to show that it was significant damage to his reputation. What, of course, he may now do, refuse them access to his press conferences, take measures effectively to stop the BBC operating in the United States. We'll see what he does. But look, he'll only be there for another 3 years. The BBC's got to safeguard its reputation. If it gives in to him, what would the rest of the world think?
But in actual fact, 2 directors general of the BBC in the last 20 years have actually quit because of journalism failures. It was Greg Dyke in 2004, also in 2012 after the Jimmy Savile affair and the failures in the reporting of that. And again, another Panorama program with serious allegations about a Conservative politician. The Director General there, George Entwistle, quit. So there's kind of a precedent for the people at the top taking absolute responsibility for single failures of journalism.
Absolutely. If you go back further, the BBC's lost 4 directors general in 40 years. I say lost, they resigned, or they were encouraged to resign. They certainly wouldn't have wanted to go. It's lost 2 chairmen in that time. It shows that the BBC is highly respected and thought to be important. It also shows that politicians of both sides, mainly on the right at the moment, but certainly it happened under the Blair government as well, take it on. They take it on because it matters. People believe it on the whole. It's still the most trusted news organisation. And they get very cross when their view of life is not automatically transmitted by the BBC. Whenever the country is divided, there's trouble. We've got very opinionated channels whose commercial survival depends upon the BBC diminishing in size and influence. What it can't do in these circumstances is keep making mistakes. And the second thing it can't do, have the goalkeeper walk away and leave an empty net when there's criticism. And that's what happened last week.
Well, I can understand for a serious failure of journalism, the CEO of News, Deborah Turner, saying the buck stops with me. But for the overall boss, the Director General, Tim Davie, to quit, pundits immediately when the news broke were pointing out it's not just this. They cited a kind of pile-up of impartiality problems. There was the reporting of Gaza, of course, but there was the Bob Villan, the Glastonbury kind of outburst that was a live broadcast, the football presenter Gary Lineker with his personal opinions about migration that caused people to question the impartiality of the BBC. But that, and also the fact that this Panorama was made by an outside company, BBC responsible for broadcasting, of course, but does the fact that most of these errors seem to be made by sort of outside people contracted in and not by the BBC's own news staff, does that not matter to people at all?
I think the programme was a joint production by a company called October Films and the BBC. But there is a problem. When I was editor of Panorama, I would have an in-house team, and you could say, well, here's a hard-hitting reporter who'll go through a brick wall, but maybe his judgment isn't 100%, so I put a rather cautious producer with him, etc., etc. And you balance a team, and therefore you make some judgments about them with an independent producer, which the BBC is obliged to use up to a certain proportion. It's a little more difficult. I think the problem with Tim Davie, his major problem was that he had no real experience of journalism. I think he was just exhausted in the end by 5 years of this. One after another of these problems does indicate that in the BBC, which has slimmed down a lot and had to cut back, standards are not as high as they were, aren't being enforced as well. and the Director General has an almost impossible job.
In your view, that Michael Prescott dossier, is it to your mind evidence of anything serious and systemic that needs correction, and new executives who take the place of the two that have left will have to clean up?
Well, it's patchy. There are one or two things there which are right, but what's strange about it, and there are a number of things that clearly, in my view anyway, show where he's coming from and show his own biases and show how selective he is in choosing what to focus upon. But what's surprising is, as we learned from the chairman's letter a week later than it should have been published, actually the BBC has taken action on a number of issues. There was a problem with BBC Arabic. They've strengthened the controls there and so on. But I think that he makes some allegations which are just reveal how partial he is. I mean, one of the fundamental problems we face, of course, is that there's this big propaganda war going on over the Middle East. And on the whole, the most effective and sophisticated propaganda is that which supports the Israeli government or of Netanyahu and so on. There's a guy, for example, called Danny Cohen, who was the former director of television of the BBC, and he always has an article ready alleging bias, which goes into the Daily Telegraph the moment an issue arises. That's fine enough, but what it should say is that Danny runs a media monitoring operation which is pro-Israeli, and there's a very sophisticated operation. Now, of course, there's propaganda on the other side. But when you're faced with this sort of propaganda, the BBC's job, as of most journalists, independent journalists, is extraordinarily difficult, and particularly where you still don't have access to Gaza. Independent journalists can't go in there. What's baffling to me is that some of the best or most interesting criticism, for example, of the Israeli government comes from an Israeli newspaper called Haaretz, which I suppose you would say is centre-left. But it shows that, there's a really vigorous debate going on within Israel, more vigorous in many ways than that which people like the Daily Telegraph and Danny Cohen would want to happen in the UK.
Well, you also mentioned there's the BBC gets hit by the traffic from both sides, but some of the people that some pundits say want to run it down are within the BBC. You mentioned it earlier. There are some people who've been appointed who have been highly critical and might want to shake things up. One figure who gets mentioned a lot is Sir Robbie Gibb, appointed by Boris Johnson. Even the guy, Michael Prescott, who wrote the dossier at the heart of this, worked for a Rupert Murdoch newspaper, also in political PR. Is it paranoid that some BBC staff are now talking of some sort of internal coup or operation within the BBC that's leaning on the board and the governors?
Well, what the facts are that Sir Robbie did work for the BBC as a journalist as well. But as you say, he's been open about himself being conservative, a very dry, as he would say, conservative, i.e. Thatcherite. He's been open that he's a Brexiteer. He maintains that he can be that on the one hand, and on the other, he can be impartial when he's working within the BBC. He was one of the people involved in the founding of GB News. He maintains that that's not relevant because when he sits on the BBC board, he is independent. He was put on the BBC board by Boris Johnson. It was Robbie Gibb who employed Michael Prescott, who is of the right-wing perspectives and so on. Now, all that is fact. Now, what they did was consistently criticise the BBC, and at a crucial moment last week when the BBC should have responded immediately to the Daily Telegraph article, which is the first of many, the board was so split, they said nothing. The other problem is, and this is a bit complex, but the BBC used to have two boards. Well, a few years ago, the BBC, those two boards were collapsed into one. And the net result of that is that the chair is sitting on this editorial standards committee with the Director General and with the others. And so when they make a mistake, the chair can't stand above it all and make a judgment because he was part of the decision making. And so but also the result of that is that people like Robbie Gibb are not sitting, as it were, above the BBC executive and talking about general principles. They are in the middle of the editorial standards committee, challenging the director of news, challenging the Director General, and putting pressure on them.
I think Boris Johnson has said it was complete and utter bollocks. I think those were his words, that Sir Robbie Gibb was appointed for that purpose.
Yeah, and he's a liar, and I'm quite happy, to be, nobody will deny that. He is, and there's plenty of proof. But I think the problem about all of that is that what we need to have is a review anyway of the way in which public appointments are made. Politicians have got too close to appointments with the BBC.
Finally, Roger, it kind of looks terrible at the moment in that mistakes have been made. Now there's a vacuum with two very significant jobs at the top of the corporation vacant at a time when it appears to be under attack from without and within, or a bit of both. But is it possibly an opportunity in that you could have a new Director General come in, wipe the slate clean, a new head of news, reassert everything and see off the Donald Trump threat, and then maybe things will improve?
The BBC is just starting the process of renewing or hoping to get its charter renewed. That has to happen by the beginning of 2027. The charter being its right to broadcast and what it needs to do. Also, the licence fee is being reviewed. So precisely at the time, you want a united BBC led by a strong Director General making the case for public service broadcasting. So it's a good 6 months, maybe 3 to 6 months before you have a DG, and then before you can have a Director of News. And by that time, you're in the middle of these renegotiations about the BBC's future. So it couldn't happen at a worse time. So if we want that to continue, and you want an impartial, or as impartial as possible news service, the BBC better get its house in order, and we better support it.
That was Roger Bolton, who for 23 years, up until 2022, hosted the BBC radio show Feedback, which aired complaints from listeners about BBC programmes. And he also hosted a similar TV show on the UK's Channel 4 called Right to Reply. These days, he's the host of a weekly podcast called Mediawatch, billed as for those who love, but are also frustrated by, the BBC. And you can hear more of what Roger had to say about what's unfolding right now at the first and biggest public broadcaster in the world in this week's Mediawatch podcast, and the online version of the story as well at rnz.co.nz. This week I also covered aspects of the BBC's crisis in Midweek Mediawatch, our weekly catch-up with Emile Donovan on nights here on RNZ National. And we also looked at how the media reacted to the startling IPCA report on misconduct at the top in the police, which was announced live during the 6 p.m. news hour on Tuesday.
Kia ora tātou. Well, a late-breaking press conference says that all this is a very serious situation. The ministers and the police commissioner, they've just made their way into the Beehive Theatre right now, so let's not waste any time. Let's go live to their announcement.
And 24 hours later, the gravity of what had been revealed and the fallout from it was still preoccupying the news bulletins.
And today, Police Commissioner Richard Chambers did say to One News that this scandal was, to use his words, one that doesn't do police any favours, and that cases like this do damage trust and confidence, which now has to be addressed.
And while all that made it pretty clear to viewers just how significant this story was, a lot had gone on behind the scenes in many newsrooms too to deal with what turned out to be an extremely sensitive story, given the parallel investigations going on into Jevon McSkimming, parts of which were suppressed. Now, one of those wrapped up for some time in all of this was the Herald's senior journalist and crime reporting specialist, Jared Savage, and he told the Herald's daily podcast Front Page this week the lawyers were involved in this almost as much as reporters and editors.
You've got to be very careful legally around not defaming people, making sure that everyone has the right to reply. In this case, you had multiple things going on. There was developments all the time, so you're having to report at speed. And it had political ramifications as well. So this was quite a tricky story to report on. Now that the floodgates are open, it's all coming out, and that's great because sunlight's the best disinfectant.
The New Zealand Herald's Jared Savage there on the Herald's podcast Front Page. And 24 hours before that bombshell dropped in Parliament on Tuesday, Te Pāti Māori's co-leaders dropped one by dropping 2 of its own MPs in one go and having a go at the media while they were at it.
And I must say that the media have enjoyed it over the last 6 weeks.
And while Te Pāti Māori really only have themselves to blame for that, and they haven't always engaged with the media in good faith, he might have had a point about that.
One of the messiest political implosions in recent memory. I'm thinking you'll be thinking shades of Jamie Lee Ross and the Southern Bridges saga even.
This is one for the ages. Eat your heart out. Jamie Lee Ross, Gaurav Sharma, Darlene Tana, Gauri Sgaraman, Michael Forbes more recently.
We also looked at that on Midweek Media Watch last Wednesday. If you missed it, that's in our podcast feed. That's it for this weekend though. Thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts for us or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz. You'll also find us at MediawatchNZ on X, and you can even write us a letter and send it to Mediawatch, PO Box 123 Wellington. I'll be back again with Midweek Media Watch next Wednesday. Catch you then. In the meantime, follow Media Watch and listen on any podcast app to make sure you never miss an episode.